Hello all, welcome to the first session of World Makings. I'll just read a brief note about the class itself and also introduce JP. So, in The Way the World Is, Nelson Goodman argues for relinquishing the idea of singular world to be described adequately by philosophy, science, or to be pictured by our artistic practices. Instead, he argued for the idea that there isn't such a thing as a world independent of any symbolizing activities. The question concerning how such world could be can receive no answer that does not already presuppose some descriptive framework of our own making. What Goodman had in mind, though, was not the abandonment of knowledge as such, but a redefinition of this notion. World making is a term he coined by the activity of knowing through the reconstruction that was developed in his later writing. This has consequences for the concept of an epistemological given on which any foundationalist picture of knowledge rests. Knowledge is always already enmeshed in the symbolizing activities that are part and parcel of the forms of life. But what about remaking of forms of life themselves? With the de-absolutization of a metaphysical foundation proposed in and through the works of Carnap, Sellars, and Goodman, comes a priority of the conceptualizing practices embedded in a contingently constituted form of life. The contingent character of this form of life, which acquires post-facto necessity for us, is then pit against its role as a condition for knowledge. The seminar intends to tackle this double character of forms of life within world-making practices. It offers an introduction to world-making while reflecting on, I'm going to butcher this, Wittgensteinian forms of life as materials for reconfiguration. The political valence of world-making practices as means of reconfiguring the world, the social world, hangs upon such questions. J.P. Caron is a philosopher and artist based in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. His doctoral research developed at the University of Paris, Paris 8, Vincent Denis, and the University of Sao Paulo proposed a critique of the aesthetic philosophy of John Cage in context of contemporary ontology of art and philosophy of language. He is a lecturer in philosophy at the UFRJ, and he militates in the Circle of Studies of the Idea and Ideology, CSII, an international political collective dedicated to examining the viability of the, quote, communist hypothesis today. He's been practicing noise and experimental music for more than 15 years, and several of his records could have been released, many through his own imprint, Seminal Records. Recently, he's been working on the problem of generic organization as it appears in different fields like art, science, politics, and its relationship to scale sensitivity. I will pass it along to you, JP.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Kelly, for the presentation. I'm not sure if everybody who should be panelists are panelists now, so please let me know if you are unduly classified here as an attendee. So, Regis, shouldn't you be a panelist? I'm not sure. Yeah. So please, yes, should be a panelist. Let me see if I can turn him. I think it has to be Kelly now, right? Yes. Regis Alves. Anybody else who's an attendee who should be a panelist? You right click, on his name, and it should appear something like promote to panelist. Okay.
I've done that.
Yeah, great. Yeah, he's there. Anybody else? No? Please let us know. Please promote me. What does that mean? Does that mean that you are enrolled or just that you have the desire to become a panelist? Okay, promote that, please.
I've done it.
Okay.
Yes, I'm enrolled.
Oh, great. Oh, yeah. So we have kind of a problem in our hands because Kelly told me like many of you are certificate students. Usually in the new center, we have this difference between, just a regular student and a certificate student. And certificate students are required to do presentations and some kind of work in order to get grades, right? So if everybody is a certificate student, you won't have the time to for everybody to make a presentation. So this is an issue. Yeah, this is an issue. So we'll have to find a solution to this problem. Kelly proposed a solution to me that would entail people organizing into groups and making group presentations. I'm not sure I like this solution very much because I think it dilutes the propositions that each individual student might want to present. So yes, I was going to say what Zeiss writing there. I talked to Reza and he told me he was kind of dividing between people who wanted to present in class and people who might prefer to just send the videos to him. So this is a possibility, and also another possibility would be just to send me a written text of, I don't know, between 5 and 10 pages or something like that about a certain issue that we are covering in the seminar. So I think we will have to come up with a compromise like that, and which means we have to decide who are the people who would present in class. So of course I would prefer the people who really want to present in class to do it. So maybe we'll just pass a list after by email and see who wants to present in class, so we don't lose a lot of time here, right? Deciding these organizational issues. So we have like 24 panelists right now. I think we can do the presentations, like the personal presentations. Who are you and what the hell are you doing here? And I will also ask very briefly, please be very brief. And also, I will also ask you to make clear who among you are certificate students. Okay, please do so. So we have a notion. Okay. So who wants to go first? Nobody wants to go
I can
first.
go.
Okay.
I'm a certificate student. My name is Zed. I'm from Brazil. I'm currently finishing my PhD in legal theory, and I already know JP for a while from before I came into the new center, and have like general interest for his research. So yeah, that's basically it.
Okay. Thanks, Zed. Who else?
I could go next. Uh,
Cássio.
my name is Cassio. I'm from Brazil also. I'm currently working on a master thesis on the cognitive aesthetic implications of the critique of the transcendental structure provided by Reza Negarestani in Intelligence and Spirits. And I'm very interesting in subjects as word making and the conceptual forms of life, since I've written the monograph on Wittgenstein in my graduation, and it was pretty much related to this concept. And yeah, that's basically it.
Thanks, Cássio.
Yeah,
Who else?
I can go. Yeah, my name is Enda. I'm
Enda.
from Ireland originally, but I'm living in London. I just finished a master's in fine arts, and before that I studied philosophy. I'm a certificate student as well. And yeah, I'm interested in questions of the subject in relation to large-scale complex problems and planetary politics in general, and all of the various things that breaks down into. That's it.
Thank you.
I can present also. Are you hearing me?
Yes, Regis. Yes.
Okay, my microphone is not very good. My name is Regis Alves. I'm based in São Paulo, Brazil also. And I'm already a little bit familiar with the work of Caron. And I'm finishing my master's dissertation on Hegel's Science of Logic. I'm applying to PhD now, and I'm very interested in the on the subject of this seminar. Mainly, I know a little bit of Sellars, but mainly Goodman and Carnap. I want to get deeper in those, and that's it. Yeah.
Thanks, Harry. Who else?
You know, I'm Catherine. I'm also a certificate student. I'm based in New York, where I work as a researcher, also on curatorial projects, but my academic background is in philosophy. And during my studies, I was partly researching critical theory, but also metaphysics, and particularly focusing on Quine and the context of that. So I've been interested in Goodman for a while, and that's why I'm here for the course. Thanks.
Great. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Maria. I'm from Moscow. I'm an art critic and seeking to incorporate more philosophy into my work, but I don't know how. I published a text last week about the Bourdieu's concept of event and reenactment. Some said the text was fine. Some said the text was pretentious nonsense, but there's always mixed reactions. And this is why I'm interested in this seminar.
Yeah, pretentious nonsense is part of the game. Thank you, Maria. So everybody is a certificate student actually up until now, right? Okay. Who else?
Hi, I'm Edna. I'm from Mexico City. I study philosophy and undergraduate level. I'm a certificate student too. And I'm interested in the intersection between technology and epistemology. So that's why I'm here. That's me.
Thank you, Edna.
Hi, can you hear me?
Who's talking? Sorry.
Me.
Zenobi.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very low
You can
volume.
turn up. Yeah.
If you could, yeah.
Yeah, I'll try. Is better now?
Not much, but okay, we can manage.
All right. So I'm not a certificate student, and I'm a design student in Brazil, and I'm trying to read and study as much as philosophy as I can to make a robust philosophy of design in the future, in future studies.
So a personal intellectual project. That's great. Thank you, Zenobi. Well,
I can go. I'm Federico. I'm also a certificate student. I initially studied arts, but I despised the art world, so I turned into philosophy. I'm currently finished a master's degree. And I'm really interested in trying to find how to integrate systematic thinking, epistemological thinking to political organization. And yeah, that's basically it. Very excited.
So we're very much together in the same kind of project. Okay, who else?
I can go. Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Cruz. I am also a certificate student dialing in from Oakland, California. I'm an interdisciplinary artist, curator, and a writer with a background in architecture and media theory, but no philosophy, really. However, I'm pretty interested in broader questions around posthumanism and non-human ontologies. So, thanks.
Thanks, Alex. And you're a certificate student as well, right? Okay, let me put it here. Who else?
Hi, I'm Malu. I'm also Brazilian, but I'm based on London. I'm finishing my BA in Fine Arts, and I'm writing my dissertation on Sloterdijk's mediology, which would be the analysis of cultural and emotion transmission. So I'm seeing that more on a digital kind of environment, and he talks about like immunology, which I guess could have something to do, I don't know, could be, I have no idea. Thank you.
Oh, you'll see. Thank you, Malu.
Yeah, I can go if that's okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm Jonathan. I'm based in London. I am Brazilian. My mum's Brazilian, so another Brazilian here. I did my undergrad in history. I just finished a master's in international relations, and I'm applying to do a PhD in politics, but with a focus on like the Anthropocene and sort of non-human, post-human sort of stuff. And yeah, that's where I'm at. I'm also a certificate student as well.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mateus. I'm not a certificate student. I've actually gone from a background in biology and science studies to a PhD now in philosophy. Also in Brazil, in UFRJ, UFRJ, or something like that. And I'm interested in this stuff, like basically in all these turns in philosophy, in recent philosophy, like the speculative turns and the materialist turns and things like that. So I'm trying to map somewhat what would be this new, let's say, philosophical world that is being composed. And that's my project. So yeah, Caron already knows that.
Yeah, of course. But it's not just for me, right? It's for everybody else as well. Even though I've been watching, Daniel's class and Reza's class, so many of the people who are here also already know each other. But nevertheless, this is the drill that we follow in the new center. So yeah, we should keep this tradition. Like at least some of you might not know everybody else, right? So who else?
Hey there, I'm Alex. I have no philosophical training, but I have a strong interest in philosophy of science and contemporary continental philosophy. I am also a certificate student, but I don't need to present live in the course of this seminar.
Okay.
Yeah, generally interested in coming to terms with some of the Goodman stuff, which I've been intrigued by, but haven't gotten into in a more serious way.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, my name is Ben Zucker. I am enrolled in the class, but I'm not technically a certificate student. And I am originally from Oakland, but currently based in Chicago, where I am a doctoral candidate in music composition and critical theory at Northwestern University.
Yeah, I have a degree in musical composition.
Yeah, so my interest is in ontologies of musical indeterminacy and improvisation. So I'd come across, Goodman before, talking about stuff, and I'm currently, starting both research and creative practice around mobilizing forms of activity and thought in free improvisational practice.
Thank you. Who else?
I can go. Hi, my name is Aladdin. I'm also a certificate student, but I don't especially need to present live neither. I have background in fine art and visual anthropology. I'm mostly here because I itch for philosophy and for the class as well. And I'm mostly studying the relationship between humans and bees from anthropology and fine art.
Thank you.
I can go. My name is Dana. I'm based in New York. I am a certificate student. I don't have training in philosophy. I'm interested in language as a means of establishing kind of a stateless commons from an anarchist perspective.
Oh. Thank you.
Hi, I'm next. Oh, you go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I'm Andrew. My background's in architecture. I'm also a certificate student. So I've come across Sellars and Goodman previously. Don't know too much about him, however, interested to find out. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. Jill?
So, hi, I'm Jill. I'm tuning in from Berlin, and I'm also a certificate student, and my background is in design, and my theoretical focus thus far has been on aesthetic theory, and I graduated with a thesis on Sian Nagai's minor aesthetic categories with regard to immaterial modes of production and platform capitalism, with like a particular focus on like social media and circulation, content circulation, yeah. And I also don't have a particular training in philosophy, and I'm interested in the class. Yeah.
Thank you. Who else?
I can go next. Hi, I'm Georgia. I'm from Greece, in Greece right now. I graduated as an architect, and I'm working as a digital artist in interactive media and some computational stuff recently. And I incorporated world making as a practice mostly, and I have some experience with Goodman. I'm here to expand this knowledge.
Thank you.
Can I go?
Yes, please, Vincent.
So my name is Vincent Arden. I'm a writer and researcher based in Manila. I'm also a certificate student. My interests include materialism, but also philosophy of nature, or even post-nature, from German Naturphilosophy to maybe Ian Hamilton Grant.
Okay, thank you. I think it's all right. Is there, Nikita.
Hello, I'm Nikita. I'm based in Moscow, and work at Caron Museum of Contemporary Art. And one of the programs that I'm planning to do this year will be focusing on world making. So I'm pretty much interested in this as applied to artistic practices, and I would really love to kind of dig into the theoretical points of that as well. And I'm quite interested in Goodman for some time as well.
Thank you. Are you a certificate student, Nikita? Sorry if you said so. Are
Yeah.
You? Okay, you are. Thank you. I think this is all right. Anybody missing? Guess not. So I count 19 certificate students. Like last year when I taught a course here in my first course in English here, there was like, I don't know, like 2. And the last time I taught something here, which was the Portuguese course, there was like 4 certificate students. So this was quite feasible and manageable. But 19 certificates, with 19 certificate students, we will really have to organize who wants to make a contribution like within the class, and who wants to maybe write something or maybe send me a video, something like that. So we will have to do something.
I can pass out, I'll send an email where people can sign up after the class.
Yeah, this would be great. Thank you, Kelly.
No problem.
Okay, so I shall share my screen and start this thing. This is the PowerPoint. I don't want the PowerPoint, I prefer the PDF. Where's the PDF? I can do that, it's not a problem. How do we make this presentation? Yeah, something like that. Okay. Yeah, as you see, I'm not the greatest designer, so my PDFs are my PowerPoints are quite poor visually, but I think they get the job done. So this is from Worldmaking to Lifeforming. The original title of the seminar, you'll see it's from Worldmaking to Lifeforming Part 1, something like this, because this was originally a 2-credit course that for a number of reasons couldn't be held as a 2-credit course. I had to turn it into a 1-credit course. So I'm thinking about making a second part, but there were some issues with this translation from 2 credit to 1 credit that made me a kind of rearrange the subjects, and fortunately this will make sense still, but it's quite dense, I think. So this is kind of a disclaimer, initial disclaimer about this course right from the start, right? So I have some introductory remarks about the idea as a whole. So this seminar intends to be an exploration of 3 different ideas. I see many people are here for the Goodman bit, but of course it was the Goodman, the idea of world making, but also how this connects to a certain Wittgensteinian idea of, you know, a language as language use, right? That is enmeshed into certain kinds of practices. So with this, I think the abstract that was published, it kind of pointed in this direction, which is the idea that world making is kind of as in the Goodmanian sense is I would say a symbolic endeavor or epistemological endeavor that suspends belief or suspends the requirement of a world, right? So world making is a response to this suspension of this requirement. But at the same time, you have language use, which is a very important component of the Goodmanian account of world making, can be thought of as being enmeshed also in practical dealings with the world, right? With what we call the world, in a sense. So the original abstract was kind of dealing with world making as applied to the means themselves that are used for world making, so to speak. So if world making in the Goodmanian sense has to do with the mobilization of systematization, symbolic systematizations of certain domains of experience, right? What about the revision of the means themselves that yields these symbolic worlds? Or you'll be familiar with this idea from maybe from Raza's class, because you know the Carnapian picture has something to do with this with the constitution of the means by which something gets conceptualized, right? Something gets framed, a world gets framed in a sense. So Goodman has a lot to do with Carnap in that sense. But in the way we are trying to build here within this course, we are trying to do this, to suture these world-making practices to a picture more akin to the second Wittgensteinian, you know, philosophy of language games. So with a practical dimension of language use. So what does it mean to, you know, revise a world which is also the world we are living in a sense? So how does these preconceptions that get made explicit and explored and tinkered with would change the ways we behave and the world which we inhabit in a sense? So there's this double, you know, circuit, like I'm kind of closing a circuit between, you know, that which is a condition for world making and world making as a means to change the condition itself, in a sense. So this is kind of the basic idea. We can find some versions of this idea, for instance, in the Sellars and tradition. So we will mention this, we'll tackle briefly and I'll say branch out to these different philosophies in due time, right? But we have then 3 ideas, not just 2, because a third idea wasn't mentioned in the abstract that I sent, but I kind of changed a little bit the contents of each class. So we have a class also about the logic of worlds by Alain Badiou, which will be the 3rd class. And this will make matters a little bit more complex as well, okay? So I will talk a little bit about that before we talk about today's papers, Catherine Elgin's paper and the chapter by Strawson, okay? So the seminar intends to be an exploration of three different ideas, two of which are mentioned in its title. So the first one is worldmaking, the idea with the eviction of the notion of a way the world is, beyond all frameworks within which it appears. All we have left is the multiple worlds of art, scientific theories, symbolizing practices in general, and etc. This amounts to redefine, in a specific sense to be examined, the idea of knowledge as the making of these multiple worlds through the mobilization of symbols. This idea stems from the philosophy of Sellars and Goodman. The second idea is the forms of life, the idea that with the off-centering of the notion of representation as a defining feature of language, it gets recast as a multiplicity of different language games, structured strings of actions that suture pieces of language to determinate context of use that jointly compose a form of life. So we have a kind of also an adumbration of a certain concept of form of life here. It is debatable whether Wittgenstein has a constructible concept of form of life. Usually a form of life in the Wittgensteinian sense is much more a stop to the investigation than a beginning of an investigation. So this is also kind of a novelty here. I think it's kind of a novelty here because we are trying to propose a constructible concept of a form of life. So in this sense, the political purport, the political valence of this investigation gets very explicit, okay? So this amounts to unground language from world and ground it in grammar, understood as the set of rules that both undergird and are negotiated within the language games themselves. This idea stems from the philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein. So the third idea, world pluralism, not only as the product of world making as in Goodman's philosophy, but as the set of parameters that constrain what one can do within a specific situation. This is quite obscure if you are familiar with the Badiouian picture, but this is kind of the cash value I'm taking out of it. So the way we are going to approach the Badiouian picture has to do with the fact that worlds for him are not subjectively defined or subjectively constructed or language constructed by language. Worlds for him are real worlds, and they are worlds nevertheless. They are worlds in the plural nevertheless. Okay, so you have a whole plethora of formalisms to do to deal with these worlds in Alain Badiou's idea, but which make explicit the fact that there are parameters and constraints that you can, within which you can move in order to understand these worlds. So these worlds are rich enough, the way Alain Badiou constructs them, that in the sense that they can yield different world pictures within the same world, what we would call, from the Goodmanian perspective, different world pictures. So what is interesting in Badiou's endeavor is the fact that he's trying to do what we usually call phenomenology, but it is an objective phenomenology. There are many, many problems with this construction, right? But nevertheless, this is the source of my interest in him within this course. It is kind of a concurrent conception of the multiplicity of worlds, and one in which what is kind of typical of a traditional understanding of realism, or what we Sellarsians would call bald realism, would locate in the one world picture, right? Which is the representational picture of language and thought and everything like that, in which the world itself is constraining or is determining what one can think, what one can talk of it. Okay, so here Badiou kind of enriches the kind of a representational picture within a set of worlds that are closed under a set of operations. This will be properly understood, I think, in the third session. So This amounts to redefine worlds, defining A as being the products of world-making practices as concrete localities closed under relevant set of operations. What disclosure means, you have to wait a little bit, those who didn't read Alain Badiou's work yet. This idea stems from the philosopher Alain Badiou. Our first 3 sessions will take each one of these ideas as a central issue, a central subject. So the first one today, we'll give a presentation of world making as a form of tinkering of the transcendental system. And here, a transcendental system is thought of as, you know, for instance, Reza talks about it, a certain structure that is capable of cognition, like, for instance, the transcendental subject of the Kantian philosophy. This will be done by studying 2 different texts that present 2 different kinds of tinkering. I forgot to erase the beginning of the next sentence there. So the second session will concentrate upon the idea of forms of life in the Wittgensteinian sense and the possibilities of upgrading them from within that comes from the Brandomian supplementation of the Wittgensteinian framework. So it's a kind of a mixed approach that we'll be reading not directly Wittgenstein because it's quite difficult to just extract from the Wittgensteinian text which are very decentered and very fragmented, unitary notion of form of life. I would have to ask you to read whole books in order to get a proper idea about what a form of life is in the Wittgensteinian sense. For instance, the Uncertitude book, for instance, which is quite short, but nevertheless, I prefer to work with secondary literature in that sense because it's quicker. I can upload, though, more stuff to be read about it. So we will be dealing with a paper with a chapter of Brandon. Brandon talks about extending the project of analysis in his book, Between Saying and Doing, and he envisages this extension by taking into account what he calls the pragmatic challenge to the project of analysis. And the pragmatic challenge is the Wittgensteinian challenge, mainly. And we'll also deal with secondary literature. We'll read a paper by Daniel Macbeth about Brandon and Wittgenstein, doing a comparison between the 2. And we'll do a feminist reading also. There is an article which does a feminist reading of the idea of forms of life in Wittgenstein. I have a few problems with disagreements with the conclusions that are in this article, but I think it's quite useful for us in the sense that forms of life are there not just as a stop of the investigation, but also as a political kind of negotiation between different forms of seeing as that inform different ways of behaving in the world. So it's quite interesting in one sense, but it is also very parochial in another sense. So we'll do like a cross critique of the 3 in this session. So the third session deals with Badiou's concept of objective phenomenology as presented in Logics of Worlds. Also, the book is quite dense and is quite complex, and the chapters are quite big, so I prefer to suggest a secondary reading that is done by Quentin Meillassoux, his student, as many of you I know, I'm sure know. And he does a very good job at presenting, at the time, the complete philosophy of Alain Badiou in quite like 12 pages or something like that. Of course, completeness here does not mean, of course, detailed analysis. It's not a detailed analysis, but it gives a complete picture in the sense of giving a sense of the whole. And within that whole, we have access to what does worlds mean for Badiou's philosophy and how he deals with the idea of a plurality of different worlds. Okay. Any questions until now? There is a discussion about Badiou already in the chat. Okay. So the three ideas have in common 3 kinds of pluralism, but we share different sets of commitments. So the first one, the Goodmanian one, entails the rejection of realism. The absence of a world to be represented tips the balance toward a form of irrealism, Goodman's own word for his position, where to know is to make. To know something is in a sense, in a certain sense, to make this thing, or to remake this thing that is being known, right? And to make is to project labels onto systematic wholes that would be recognized as world versions. Okay. The second, which is the Wittgensteinian one, entails the autonomy of grammar. The best way to capture this idea quickly is to remind us of Jacques Bourdieu's formula, which says Wittgenstein's position on this point is, as we have seen, that certain facts could make our language games impossible or without interest, but that none of the facts which we can note and mention made them necessary. This seems like a stupid quote, but it is a quite subtle and quite complex idea. I'm very fond of Jacques Bourdieu, and this is a quote that is following me throughout my whole life, because this is a quite difficult thought, I think, to bear in mind, that, you know, language grammar could be autonomous in a certain sense. From this autonomy, you could gain an idea of what does it mean to have different forms of life with the same material, so to speak, like with sounds and marks on paper, which forms language. The powers of language to remake what we are seeing as, right? At the same time, it is not completely independent. It is autonomous without being completely oblivious to the constraints that are there, in a sense, in, you know, in a physical world, in a material reality in which we are dealing. Okay, so the relationship between a certain language game and the world within which it is enmeshed is a kind of a constraining one, but not a representing one. And when it is a representing one, it's just one case of a possible language game, among others. Okay, so this is the basic idea. I think this idea will follow us throughout the course. So this is why I'm emphasizing that a lot right now. While suspending realism as ultimate justificatory instance of the forms of life, it embeds world-making practice within the real of language as use. Saying is a doing. Okay, so what is making the doing? What is doing the doing that is the saying? This is a question that gets asked within the Wittgensteinian picture. So, and C, the Badiouian picture entails the objectivization of phenomenology. While maintaining the idea of a plurality of different worlds, Alain Badiou's approach thinks of phenomenology, which is the study of that which appears in contradistinction to that which is the subject of his ontology, which is in the Being and Event book, as independent of a subject. Objective phenomenology is then the study of worlds in their own ways of appearing, untethered from the structures that are specific to a transcendental subject and or of language. In that sense, worlds are also independent of language use, in a sense. It doesn't take much to recognize the mutual incompatibilities between the three positions. While A and B recognize the centrality of language in the determination of our ways of seeing the world, C thinks of language as secondary in the determination of worlds. While A and C recognize a fundamental plurality of worlds, B suppose extra-worldly context as a real within which forms of life gain traction. While C and B recognize the real as a form of constraint upon what is possible, A evicts any form of realism. This has the form of inconsistent triad, Sellars and inconsistent triad. A set of philosophical problems emerge from these incompatibilities. The question of the kinds of pluralism, pluralism of symbolic systems, pluralism of real worlds, pluralism of forms of life. The question of realism, under what conditions can world pluralism be thought of as realist or anti-realist? The question of language itself, its role in the constitution of worlds frameworks, which is accounted for differently by the aforementioned positions. the question of the subjective objective character of what appears, and the question of the given. So this is a set of questions I am emphasizing here. I said the kind of the incompatibilities produce a kind of inconsistent triad in the Sellarsian sense. So it is here. I don't think I should delve into that right now. I think it's too early for that, but well, I wrote it right there. So I will send the PowerPoint and you'll see it, and we can discuss this later, I think, because this is quite technical. So any questions for now? I will now talk about today's session. So I think it's a good point to get some questions. Please don't be shy. Nobody? Does that mean that everybody is understanding everything, or does that mean that this is all too obscure in order to yield the question?
Caron, some of them was discussing the chat about the difference about Badiou, pluralism of words, and modal logic, possible words.
Yeah, I was expecting this question to appear. Okay, go on. Sorry. Is there a question? Anybody from the chat? Yeah, I'm not dealing with modal realism here. I think it's an entirely different subject in a sense. Of course, those three positions, those three kinds of pluralism that I'm dealing with, they're also quite different. But in a sense, they are dealing with they kind of battle each other within the same battlefield, so to speak. So the issues are kind of the same, which has to do with what I just said, the questions that are yielded by their incompatibilities. For instance, the question of realism or anti-realism, the question of the position of the subject, the question of the difference between seeings and seeings as. So this is quite important, and it's quite crucial to have a grasp of what does it mean to understand world-making practices, right? Whereas modal realism, which is actually a kind of formalization of modal statements, right, that takes into account possible worlds and treats them as ersatz real worlds. Of course, there is a debate around that, because David Liu is one of the proponents of the idea. He thinks we should think of possible worlds as being literally real, not actual, of course, because they are possible worlds, but in a sense, real worlds. But they are causally, temporally, spatially segregated from our actual world. So this is a crucial difference, right? Whereas in Goodman, you have a kind of world pluralism. Not really. There is a kind of a difficulty in defining what a world is in the sense of Goodman, but the point is that the different conceptualizations that can be thought of a world are sometimes jointly incompatible. So this is why he appealed to this idea of pluralism. So you can't really think of them as partial versions of the same thing, because they are incompatible at some points, at some specific points. So this is quite different because they are all actual. These are all actual. The Badiouian account is more subtle in that sense, because worlds in the Badiouian account, they are modally neutral. You don't get to say from the purely formal point of view whether they are actual or whether they are possible or what their modality really is. But usually the way he's mobilizing them is in the sense of different real worlds that are closed under a certain set of operations. This is why they are worlds, and they are infinite and yet closed. This is so, but you have a kind of a robust account of what a world as a certain unity is, which is kind of lacking in the Goodmanian sense, because Goodman is much more interested in the processual making of worlds, the processual techniques that yields different symbolic systems and different understandings that can be thought of as different worlds. Okay? So I think it's a very different subject in this sense, because we would have then to deal with modality, and this is not really this was not really the point of this course. Basically, this is why I'm not dealing with modal realism, which would be kind of maybe a fourth kind of pluralism. But these worlds are modally segregated, so this is not really a pluralism about the actual. This is the basic difference, whereas the three others are pluralism about the actual. So it can be understood in that way. Okay, is this satisfying as an answer, even if there was no question? Let me see the chat. Yeah, yeah, it seems it's satisfying. Okay. Yeah, I already, yeah, I think I answered that. Okay, did I? Is that okay? Okay, so. Okay, so let's go back to that. Okay, in what follows, I will firstly give a preliminary and programmatic idea by commenting on two different approaches to the problems of world making that touch on two different levels to be pursued in these investigations. So here I'm justifying why am I putting Goodman and Strawson in relationship in this class, which is quite a weird pairing in a sense. You'll see why I'm not necessarily, I don't need to pronounce it beforehand. So the first will be Goodman's notion of world making as a term encapsulating prima facie the idea of the theory ladenness of our judgments of knowledge, like prima facie in the first sense, in the sense that there isn't such a thing as a framework independent world, which means that much of what we take the world to be like is the result of conceptual contraptions of our own making. Secondarily, the epistemological purview of what Goodman calls non-verbal world versions, which is quite an important idea here. The idea that even if artistic aesthetic practices aren't immediately thought of as producing knowledge claims, they inform what the world is taken to be once the idea of a framework independent world is out of the window. So in a sense, both scientific theories and artistic practices are world constituting activities for Goodman. So this is quite important. And if you read the Catherine Elgin's text carefully, this is mainly her justification. Like the first section of the text, she's just justifying why is she talking all that things is because she wants to yield a different picture of epistemological picture, a different epistemological picture, wherein not only claims and inferences between claims count as knowledge, but also different kinds of world-yielding practices such as art and pictorial practices, all kinds of different practices that come to, in a sense, classify a realm, classify a domain of objects. And by classifying a domain of objects, it is deciding upon what is like what else, deciding upon likeness, right? So Also, I know some of you are familiar with the 7 strictures on similarity, a classic text by Goodman, which is a quite a cogent critique of the idea of similarity as a criterion. Okay, so this has to do with this particular point, that the adoption of different systems decide what is like what else. Okay, it's deciding what counts as likenesses. Okay, this is quite important. So this is the first part of today's class. The second is a brief excursion into the thought experiment conceived by Peter Strawson, the second chapter of his Individuals, a book from 1959, wherein he imagines the possibility of a no-space world, modeling it upon what he proposed to be a purely auditory world, a world without given objecthood, but composed solely of sounds. This is a way to bracket the particular way our forms of intuition are entangled, even if this bracketing wasn't the objective of Strawson's thought experiment per se, but rather a means to test the persistence of certain properties of our actual perceptual framework. So there is a fundamental, this is what I was pointing at. This pairing is quite odd because there is a fundamental philosophical difference between Strawson and Goodman, in the sense that Strawson is fundamentally a conservative philosopher. He's in the business of what he calls descriptive metaphysics against what he calls revisionary metaphysics. So this whole course deals with revisionary metaphysics in a sense, even if Goodman doesn't want to think of himself as a metaphysician, even though he has a strongly nominalist position, which can be cast as a metaphysical position, and is cast as a metaphysical position if you are familiar with, for instance, the literature on the ontology of artworks that deals with Goodman's positions on this issue. So Goodman gets cast as a certain metaphysical position, a specific metaphysical position that is nominalist. Okay. But nevertheless, this course deals with the possibility of revision, okay, of change in conceptual frameworks, basically, and in practices, in the set of practices that are constraining these conceptual frameworks. Okay. And whereas Strawson is not really concerned with that. Strawson is concerned with the description of what he takes to be our actual structure of experience. So this chapter that I picked for today is quite odd in Strawson's work. Usually, what usually is Strawson's work is kind of a very extreme example of world making, but that is mobilized as a test against which our actual structure, spatial structure of localization can be measured in a sense. So Strawson's concern is actually to test the survival of a certain system of coordinates within this completely bizarre and completely reimagined world of purely auditory phenomena. Okay, and this is because he wants basically to test the possibility of a no space world. So this is also quite from the start polemical, because as I think many people would object. Sounding world is it's not a no space world. So there are still more caveats in order to understand why this purely auditory world would perform the role that Strawson wants it to perform. Okay, so there's a whole story there to be told. But yes, the point is, even if this is tethered to a conservative project of describing our actual structure of experience and not to the project of world making, it is nevertheless a good example of a second species of revision that I want to tackle. The first one is what I usually call the upstream revision of our conceptual frameworks that define our seeings as. So there's this basic difference between seeings and seeings as. What is a seeing as, right? So seeings are basically what you see because there are things get to your eyes. Like it's a question of contact between systems. Okay. Seeing as is the putting of this sensible content under a certain concept. So you are seeing this sensible content as some other kind of content. So you're seeing something as something, in other words. So this is what usually the Sellars tradition, also the Wittgensteinian tradition, tends to call a seeing as. So the most familiar example is the, duck rabbit from the philosophical investigations of Wittgenstein, which is this picture that he takes from the Gestalt psychology of his day that can be seen in two different senses. Like you can, if you look for it, you'll see a rabbit, or either you see a rabbit or you'll see a duck. Okay, so it's not a matter of visual contact. This is the idea. It's not a matter of visual contact. Visual contact is already enmeshed in conceptualizing practices and presuppositions in all this kind of these upstream organizing functions. So world making, in the sense of Goodman, I am just understanding it in that sense, in the sense of applying organizational systems to sensible contexts that yield different results. Okay. And the variability of these different conceptual systems yields a variability of different worlds. Some of them which are incompatible with each other. This is the basic idea. And the second idea, which Strawson gives a good example of, is conversely the downstream possibility of imagining a different sensible world itself. Not just a different conceptualizing framework to be applied on the sensible contents to which we have already our access, but the revision of the sensible contents themselves, the forms of intuition themselves, like what would yield to live in a world devoid of space, for instance, which is a good question of this kind of endeavor. So there I'm dividing the idea of world making in two, like in the downstream sense of revision of the transcendental, in the sense of its forms of intuition, and the upstream sense of the revision of the categories under which such sensible contents get classified, which yield different world understandings. Okay. Any question about this? You unmuted yourself, Mateus.
Yeah, I'm trying to think, because in the end, when you summarize the differences between upstream and downstream revisionary modes, I guess I lost it a bit. Like downstream and upstream sounded a bit like the same, but so upstream is the transcendental revision, and downstream is making a world up. Like
they are both. I understand them both to be revisions of the transcendental system. Okay, but the transcendental system would comprise sensible apparatus, sensible contents. I don't like to respond like that. I prefer, yeah. The transcendental system would comprise sensible apparatus, but also conceptual functions. Okay. So I am putting both Goodman's idea of world making and Strawson's revisionary stance that is particular to this chapter, because it's not something that he takes in this philosophical project as a whole. I'm localizing them as two different kinds of revision. Okay, of course, possible objection would be to say that the Straussonian picture he's trying to explore is also, of course, a conceptual revision, because he's imagining this different world. Of course, it is a function of conceptual imagination, but the material that is being revised in this imagined world are the forms of intuition themselves, like our intuition of time and space. It's not primarily the conceptual apparatus by which we understand these forms. And how do I know it is not the conceptual apparatus? Because the whole point that Strawson is making is how does this conceptual apparatus survive under such revision? So what is at stake is the conceptual apparatus, and what is being modified is the sensible forms of intuition. Okay? So this is how I am reading Strawson. So the material that is being modified as like an axiom. Let's imagine a no-space world. Okay, this is the axiom, and the axiom purports to the forms of intuition, and the consequences to be looked into are the consequence of this revision upon the possible conceptualizations that it can support. So this is how you get to understand the question: can we have a re-identification of a particular item without the space as a coordinate? So this is how I am understanding the Strawsonian idea. And whereas the Goodmanian one, the material that is being modified is primarily the conceptual apparatus that are responsible for our seeing as. Of course, this is complex. This is a complex distinction to make, because once we vary these conceptual apparatus, the sensible results kind of change, because we are seeing things differently. But what does it mean to see things differently in this sense? How do I know that what is being changed is a conceptual apparatus? Okay, because he's not really imagining a situation wherein the fundamental coordinates or forms of intuition are being modified. He's only imagining situations wherein we are classifying and grouping things differently. We are committing ourselves to different judgments of likenesses. And judgments of likeness, as I said, is a quite important affair, right? So it justifies categorization, and by justifying a certain categorizations, different categorizations, it is justifying different worlds in the Goodmanian sense. So this is why I'm talking about an upstream form and a downstream form. Downstream because this is the material of this revision are the forms of intuition themselves, is not really superior conceptual functions. And the upstream form is given the forms of intuitions we already have, there is a revision to be made upon the conceptual apparatus that take these as the material and put them under certain specific conceptualizations.
I believe I have a question. I don't know if it makes sense, but in this process, this downstream process of revision of the sensible apparatus and the forms of intuition, where does the grammatical processes of revision or the grammatical dimension stops, and therefore it is required, I don't know, technological modifications in this sensible apparatus?
Yes.
I don't know.
Yes.
Is there a complementarity relation between these two processes, or different in nature? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, but I think this question will be answered more completely during the next session, because you were asking about grammar. I know you quite well. I know what you have in mind. Like grammar is this Wittgensteinian notion of, you know, the set of rules that is responsible for the language games, in a sense, we play. And by being responsible for the language games we play, is kind of responsible for the world we live in a sense. So, yes, this is quite similar to the first kind, to the Goodmanian sense of revision for me, because it's a revision in grammar, and the revision in grammar is the revision, if we go to the details of the Wittgensteinian account, is the revision of the grammatical propositions we take as operative, what Wittgenstein would call in the uncertitude hinge propositions. There is a quite interesting use of hinged propositions in a project quite similar to this that I'm proposing in a paper by Ray Brassier that is in a collection about Meillassoux and Sellars and Kant. I don't remember really the name of the paper. I don't remember, but it's in that collection that Fabio Gironi organized. He ends this paper talking about hinged proposition. What is a hinged proposition in the Wittgensteinian sense? A hinged proposition is a proposition that has the appearance of a descriptive proposition, like everybody has an extension. This is a good example. It looks like it's describing a certain situation, but it can't be false. So it's not really a descriptive proposition. So in Wittgenstein, you have this very interesting test of things that can't be false. Not in our actual picture, of course, because if you go to the second form, the revision of the forms of sensibility, of course, this wouldn't be necessarily true anymore. But within a certain world, a certain picture that is actual, that we take to be actual, okay, a proposition like everybody has an extension has to be true. So Wittgenstein interprets this phenomenon as it's not being a descriptive proposition, because it can't be false. If it can't be false, it can't be describing nothing, right? So for Wittgenstein, this is a rule. This is what a hinge proposition is. This is a rule for the use of the concept of body and of the concept of extension. The rule is stating that there is a fundamental relationship between these two concepts. And we use these concepts within descriptive proposition as if these inference obtain. So this is a hinge proposition. So what Ray Brassier says in that paper is that, of course, he's moving within the Sellarsian picture, so it's something that we didn't delve into here. But he's talking about the possibility of revision within language, of rational revision within language. So, of course, language is getting revised all the time. We'll see some examples of this right now when we talk about Elgin's paper. But he's talking about a rational revision of language. So, in a sense, he's talking about the taking control of the semantic means of production. So there are the sentences the linguistic infrastructure we have are the organon of semantic organon. So if we can have access to language in a revisionable sense, we are taking control of the semantic means of production. And he's putting a place of honor there with the revision of hinge propositions. So what does it mean to revise a hinge proposition? You are really revising the concept you use. If you revise a hinge proposition, it means the form of life has changed, right? Because these kind of judgments that are not true or false, because they are rules, they comprise the form of life. So this is the profound idea behind that. And this has everything to do with our second session and with this course. So your question is very welcome, actually. But also it was a question about boundaries. what is the boundary between, you know, the first kind and the second kind? Oh, this is a perennial philosophical question. It is something that we can maybe be sure about which kind of revision is going on, but we can't really be sure in the sense of pointing exactly the boundary between these kind of revisions. These are two different questions. The question of which kind of revision are you doing, and the question of what is the boundary between one kind of revision and the other kind of revision. So this is quite tricky. This is a different thing. I think maybe we have some resources to tackle into that question of boundaries in the third session, when we talk about worlds as complete totalities closed under a certain set of operations, as in the Badiouian sense. We'll see if we can tackle this question. Thank you, Cassio. Okay, I think I should go on if there's no questions. So I have still 1 hour and a little bit. So
there's actually a question in the from Lauren in the chat.
What?
It is. Lauren, did you want to ask your question out loud?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think it's a good question, but I think it's too early for that. Let's maybe at the end of today we can get a sense of that. Okay, okay, Lauren. Okay, let's go. I think Zé wanted me to go back to a previous slide. Is that it, Zé?
No, never mind. It's just that I was reading something, and since you weren't going on yet, I wanted to, but now just never mind.
Okay, here, this one.
Yeah, thanks, but you don't have to worry. Like, you can go on.
Okay. So Goodman's world-making ideal. So this is a quote from Goodman. Consider to begin with the statement, the sun always moves and the sun never moves, which, though equally true, are at odds with each other. Shall we say then that they describe different worlds, and that there are as many different worlds as there are such mutually exclusive truths? Rather, we are inclined to regard the two strings of words not as complete statements with truth values of their own, but as elliptical for some such statements as under frame of reference A, the sun always moves, and under frame of reference B, the sun never moves. Statements that may both be true of the same world. Frames of reference, though, seem to belong less to what is described than to systems of description, and each of the two statements relates to what is described to such a system. If I ask about the world, you can offer to tell me how it is under one or more frames of reference. But if I insist that you tell me how it is apart from all frames, what can you say? We are confined to ways of describing whatever is described. So this is the basic gist of the Goodmanian ideal of world making. But even if we are confined to the different descriptions we have with reference to what is being described, we are not confined to just descriptions. According to Goodman, there are different ways of referring to a scenario besides verbal description, ways that constitute our non-verbal symbolizing practices, such as artistic aesthetic practices, for one example, that symbolize through denotation, yes, but also through classification, expression, and exemplification. A more detailed examination of such routes of reference is proposed in Catherine Elgin's Knowing and Making, which is the first chapter of a book written in collaboration with Goodman himself, Reconceptions in Philosophy. This is the last book Goodman wrote. He wrote with this philosopher, Catherine Elgin. She does a great job presenting, making actually a complete presentation of Goodman's philosophy, because she's weaving such different subjects that Goodman deals with in different phases of his philosophy. So she's talking about inductive practices that is present in the 50s and 60s in his work in Fact, Fiction, Forecast. She's talking about symbolization systems that are dealt with in 1968 in Languages of Art. She's talking about how different constructional systems yield different systems of appearances, which is the subject of his first book in 1951, Structure of Appearance. She's talking about the multiplicity of worlds, which is the subject of the book of 1978 book, Ways of World Making. So it's this is why I chose this text. It's not a text by Goodman, but it's a text of by this close collaborator of Goodman, and she does a great job in giving a synoptic view of Goodman's philosophy in a systematic sense, which is not really common to give this systematic synoptic view of Goodman's philosophy, because typically people have more access to one part of his philosophy than other parts, and they don't get to read the whole thing and see how it hangs together in a sense. Okay? So I'll just text the complete presentation of Goodman's philosophy. I take it to be a complete presentation. One thing that is missing, though, which is quite important, is a justification of Goodman's nominalistic proclivities. This is not really dealt with, but we can talk about it later. It can be divided in 7 different thesis subjects with relevant subdivisions with an initial desideratum. The desideratum states epistemology, as we conceive it, comprehends understanding or cognition in all of its modes, including perception, depiction, and emotion, as well as description, and it investigates the ways each of these informs and is informed by the others. So the first, I would say the first subject or thesis is dependence between knowledge and experience go both ways. Like this is in contradistinction to the classical empiricist picture wherein, you know, knowledge is constrained by experience. But here he is saying dependence between knowledge and experience goes both ways, which means knowledge rests upon experience as much as experience is determined by knowledge. Knowledge constitutes expectation and schematisms that gives form to further experiencing. Okay, this is the first one. Second one, plurality of systems of categories or kinds that structure what we perceive. So I have a few quotes about this. So our sensations, like everything else, are subject to a variety of characterizations. The range of available alternatives is a function of the conceptual systems we have constructed and mastered. And then she says, the ability to describe, represent, or recognize anything requires command of a system of categories in terms of which a domain is organized. I think this proposition is important, but it's kind of dubious, because when you say that describing, representing, and recognizing requires command of a system, it seems it requires command of a system as a system. It seems she's saying you have to master a system as a system, which means mastering something that you are seeing as a system, which is not always the case. The mastering of a system not necessarily requires seeing it as a system, okay? So many of these systems, what she's calling systems and what Goodman calls systems, are not explicitly systems sometimes. They are systems that emerge by habituation many times. Okay, so this is a quite important thing. The systematization that is typical of Goodman's philosophy, it's something that comes typically after the fact, and it yields certain explicit results. And the relationship of these results with the results you had before the systematizing is not necessarily identical. This is quite dramatic when he talks about symbol systems, systems of symbolizing. Okay, we'll talk about this in a bit. So the third one is the mind is actively engaged in perception, just as it is in other modes of cognition. It imposes order on as much as it discerns order in a domain. Moreover, things do not present themselves to us in any privileged vocabulary or system of categories. So this is quite against, for instance, the Straussonian picture, the Straussonian project of descriptive metaphysics, wherein he basically states that we have an ahistorical system of categories. I will read a quote about this in a few moments. What Goodman and Elgin and Goodman are saying is that there is no self-authenticating layer of experience which yield a specifically foundational system of categories, because as he says in his Grublin paradox, which we'll see in a short moment, there is not the difference between primitive and derived. Has much to do with habituation, has much to do with the history of the system of categories that we are using and that are entrenched. Because in the logical sense, we can understand more natural system as, in a sense, derived from other less natural systems, like natural in the sense of our second nature, okay, of our ready at hand mobilizing of such systems of categories. Okay? So this is quite important as well. So a system is a scheme applied to a realm. Here, business gets serious. So what is a system? So a family of labels constitute a scheme that are applied to a realm of objects. Schemes do not provide different labels for the same collection of objects. They sort the objects into different collections, which is different, okay? So the collections we see as collections are the function of the labels that we are applying that are the function of a scheme, okay? To decide whether things are alike, then we have to know what system is in play. Here again, I think she's kind of dubious with this idea of knowing what system is in play. Sometimes you actually explicitly know, sometimes you're just doing it and implicitly apply a rule without necessarily knowing which rule you are applying. But this is my supplementation to this picture, okay? This is something that will get further explained in the second session, okay? The structure of this course is all, you know, connected in that sense. But yes, I mostly agree with this. So systems are not languages. This is quite important. Among familiar non-linguistic systems are notational systems and representational or pictorial systems. If we look at the differences among these systems, the importance of certain syntactic and semantic features become evident. So you can have different systems that are within language and different systems that are not linguistic systems. For instance, he's thinking of what he calls pictorial system. A pictorial system is basically the way pictures picture as a representational system that is not linguistic. And the test of the linguistic is the presence of an alphabet for him. So we'll talk about this. So here we have like the three different classification of systems that we get if you read Languages of Art, which I recommend everybody to do because it's such an impressive achievement. And is basically proposing a unified account of symbolic systems, okay, wherein you find different modalities of these symbolic systems. So the book is called Languages of Art, but this is kind of also dubious and misleading in a sense, because it talks a lot about art, but art is not really the subject. The subject is much more general than art. Like the subject is the systems by which we get to make worlds. So art is only the paradigmatic domain wherein you can see many of these systems at work, okay? So this is basically the basic idea of the book. And within this book, we can also find different reflections that are motivated by art, but they are not specific to art. They are much more general than only talk about art, right? For instance, the difference between the autographic and the allographic. Some of you might be familiar with this. which stems from his consideration of the forms of art wherein it makes sense to talk about the difference between an original and a copy, for instance, and the forms of art wherein there's no sense to be made of this difference. Like in painting, you have the difference between the original and the copy. This is because you don't have a notation for painting. The only criteria you have for a painting, of identification of a painting for him, and this is 1968, please. So we are not talking also about digitization of paintings yet. The only identification criteria for a painting is the original, because if you don't have an alphabet, you don't have a limit between characters that are to be maintained in order for you to for the identity of the work to be stable. So if the identity of the work is not does not depend upon an alphabet, the only way you could be sure to be in front of the work is to be in front of the original. So this is the basic idea of the autographic form of art. So in painting, because for instance, he talks also about how do we call this? Engraving. Okay, in engraving is also an autographic form of art because you don't have a notation for it. The test between an original, legitimate original, and a copy is the fact that the copies that are part of the original come from the same, how do you call that? The same engraving, I don't know, thing there that does the engraving. So because you don't have the annotation for this. So the criteria is causal in a sense for orthographic words, whereas for allographic words, the criteria of identification is notational. You have a notation, okay? And the notation is that which emancipates a work from an original or from a causal chain in that sense. So this has very important metaphysical consequences as well. But here, then he comes with this classification of different symbolic systems. So the representational systems are typical of these, autographic forms, and they are typical of pictures. Okay, so they are syntactically dense. What does that mean? The formal definition of a syntactically dense system is that for every difference of character, between every different character, you find another character, right? So this amounts to say you don't have an alphabet because you don't have what he calls finite differentiation. Finite differentiation is the limits that are the boundaries between characters within a language. So if you don't have a language, you have a synthetically dense schema, okay? And in pictures, they are also semantically dense, right? You see an abstract painting, you don't have really, what is the semantics of such a system? He prefers to use, instead of meanings, the idea of compliance. So this is also easier to understand the other way around if we start with a notational, okay, system. A notational system is differentiated syntactically and also differentiated semantically. This sounds like an idiot thing, a stupid thing, but it's not at all, and it is quite counterintuitive in a sense, because a notation for him, a paradigmatic example of a notation is a musical notation, for instance, and he says so because he thinks that music logically needs a criteria of identification for the work, because it's a performing art, and you have this kind of identity of different instantiations of different performances. So you get to ask, what does count as a legitimate performance of the same work? For Goodman, the criteria is the notational system that has to be notational in his technical sense, which means syntactically and semantically differentiated, which means, in turn, that you have an alphabet in the syntax. So this is easily verified for, traditional musical notation. You have like dots on staves, and they are finitely differentiated, okay? And they are semantically differentiated. This is maybe the most polemical proposition, which means the compliance of these marks, they are also differentiated as the marks are, which means if you put an E flat on a stave, the sound that is answering to that mark, that mark means the compliant is a sound, a specific sound, okay, and not another. So you have finitely differentiated compliance as well. This is quite bizarre for music, needless to say. Like it captures something of the practice, but at the same time, as I was saying, his effort in systematization makes it quite counterintuitive, and it starts to be kind of not much descriptive of a practice as prescriptive in a sense. So for instance, if you read Languages of Art, at some point he's talking about, John Cage and the kind of indeterminate scores that populate contemporary music. I'm a practitioner of this kind of score as well. And or he talks about improvisation, for instance, and all these things. And his conclusion is that these are legitimate forms of art, but they do not produce works. So a work is logically defined by a notational system. And the notational system is defined as a system that is both syntactically and semantically differentiated. Okay? So in distinction to that, the representation system is quite easy. So it's semantically dense and syntactically dense because you don't have an alphabet, and the compliants are not also either differentiated. And the discursive system, which is a kind of combination, which are languages proper, is a system that is syntactically differentiated. You have different alphabets and different strings of characters that makes up words, okay? But they are semantically dense because the meanings of those words, while they appear to be differentiated, they have several overlaps, okay? So one of his demonstrations of this is the fact that if you talk about a steel table, a table made of steel, and you go to the compliant, you start with the mark or the word or the predicate, a steel table, and you consider it's compliant, which is a steel table. By looking at the compliant, you don't know what the mark is, because you look at a steel table, you can understand it as an example of a table, an example of a steel object, an example of a physical object, an example of an artifact. So these are all different marks. This is because you don't have univocal determination between differentiated scheme and a differentiated realm as you have in the notational system. Here you have a differentiated scheme and a dense realm, and it yields all these confusions. So there are a bunch of different conclusions to this. For instance, what is the identity of a literary piece of work for him? The only sure way to know to identify a piece of literary work is what he calls sameness of spelling. So it is the syntactic part that makes the identification, right? Because it is differentiated. So that means that translations does not count as instantiations of the same work for him. Translations are literally different works that are versions maybe of the original work, but they are literally different works, not the same work. because the domain is semantic. The domain, the realm is dense, which means it is semantically dense and not differentiated. So this is the basic gist of, the second part of languages of art. It is a lot, I know, but it's quite interesting and quite false at sometimes, but it's quite an achievement of, philosophical acumen. If anybody has a question about this, I understand. No?
I have a question regarding the notational system. When you talk about a compliance, I'm thinking about bijection, as someone said in the chat, like a one-to-one correspondence. But yeah. I don't know in which terms Goodman talks about that, like a relation of, I think not, but as a representation, the represented and the representation, I think not, because representational is another thing in this terminology.
No, it's compliance. It's a compliance relation.
It's compliance. Compliance is the, okay.
Yeah. Okay. Compliance is the relationship between a mark and a this is kind of difficult because it's a compliant. He's using compliant exactly because he doesn't want to use representations or meanings. These are all specific to certain systems, okay? So compliance is the general term. A compliant is something that is in the place of a certain mark or is something that the mark is in the place of. Okay, this is a compliant. And a compliant, what is tricky and interesting is that a compliant can be another language. Like a compliant can be a piece of another language, in a sense. So it's not really a relationship between a symbolic system and the world as such. Is a generalized relation between schemes and realms. And the realm can be another language. The realm can be words, for instance. And you can build a classification for words. We do this with grammar, with traditional grammar, for instance, or linguistics and all of that. So it's not really a question of representation in the sense of representing the world, but is a formal relationship between pieces of systems. Like sometimes the system is the system doing the picturing, and sometimes the system is the system being pictured. So what is really weird about music, for instance, as a paradigm of the notational system of notations, is that all this thinking about the relation one-to-one between marks and compliance, this yields a picture of music making wherein if you play a piece and you miss a note, you didn't play the piece. It's not that you played the piece badly, you didn't play the piece. This is a counterintuitive conclusion because, if the notational system is the identificational criterion, if you miss a note, you didn't play what's notated. You played another thing. You actually played what would be pictured by a different notation. So it is a different word. So this is a weird thing, okay? And of course, this is why, John Cage is like something that is legitimate artistically, but it's not yielding works, because works has to be within the musical realm, such notational entities in the sense of being, of having what he calls perfect compliance between syntax and the compliance class and the semantics of the system. And this is linked to his nominalist proclivities, because, for instance, if you read about the ontology of musical works, which is a whole field in the contemporary philosophy, I wrote about it because my doctoral thesis has like 80 pages about criticizing the ontology of musical works as it's being developed in this field. If you read works on that of this literature, you will see that there are also Platonist positions. Platonist positions are fundamentally different because the criteria of identification of a work is not notational. The criteria of identification of the work is an abstract sound pattern that is instantiated within the work. So you can make mistakes because every instantiation is imperfect already in that sense. So the Platonist picture, some people prefer the Platonist picture because it yields these results that are in a sense more akin to actual practice. But you have to believe in uninstantiated abstract sound patterns. So this is a hard negotiation to have. So why Goodman makes the notation as central because of his nominalist proclivities. He doesn't want to have anything to do with abstract entities in the Platonist sense. So everything will hinge upon the notation or the system, be it representational, discursive, or notation. Okay? So this is why symbolic systems are that important for Goodman in that sense. And the mobilization of these different symbolic systems are some of the most important means of world making. This will be further and explicitly thematized in the next book, the Ways of World Making book of 1978. Okay? So is that a good answer?
Yeah, just one little thing, if I understood it well. So for him, there are no works of visual arts, and differentiate. And another question, in the sense he's talking about, in the sense the notational system is semantically differentiated, is the same thing as saying there is a isomorphic structure between what is between the two things that the compliance is there. It's a very bad way.
Yeah, but you know, isomorphism can be a very general property as well. Like we can have a whole discussion about it because I'm in the process of understanding Sellars and picturing, but at the same time criticizing it now because of this isomorphism requirement. Because if you don't determine at which level the isomorphism obtains, it is quite trivial. Anything can be isomorphic with a plethora of different things, right? So it all depends upon the level of differentiation of the system doing the picturing and the system being pictured, okay? So in a sense, yes, it is an isomorphism, but it's an isomorphism, very constrained isomorphism, okay? So the compliance for music are sounds that are count one by one in relation to differentiated scheme of marks, okay? So this is the specific kind of isomorphism going on in music. And if you want to apply a notational system elsewhere, you will have to define the level at which, you know, compliance count as one, and the relationship they have to marks that count as one as well. What is a mark? What does count as a mark also? So it's quite stricter than just saying that there is a isomorphism going on. The thing with Sellars and picturing is, you know, it is plausible because it is so, in a sense, trivializable. Because it's very implausible to think that our language bottoms out in some kind of formal isomorphism between two realms. To determine the realms. Okay, so this is quite bizarre actually, and to think that and to counter that bizarreness by saying, okay, but isomorphisms are quite trivial. But then you don't have the criteria of projection between one and the other. So this is the tricky question. I'm just putting out there because I know we have this discussion about picturing for a while, but we can discuss this later. Thank you, Regis.
Okay.
There was also a question in the attendee panel from Gabriel. He asked, are all systems, if not linguistic, semiotical in the sense of languages of art?
I would say semiotical in the sense that they're, how do you say that, routing of marks and stuff. Okay, so in that sense, it is semiotical because it has to do with a kind of relationship that is not a causal physical relationship. Like it gets to be, it becomes a causal relationship because we are beings that take into account these kind of correlational relationships. Okay, but it's not a directly causal relationship in the physical sense. Okay. So yes, I would say semiotical, but not linguistic in that sense, because if you understand semiotics as this routing relationship between one symbol being in place of another symbol or another thing.
I have a quick question about whether you could maybe say more about the dependence of Elgin schema and Goodman schema on a publicness or exteriority, because I think maybe this relates also to some questions that were being raised about mutual intelligibility between frameworks. And I was thinking that maybe Strawson's the picture Strawson presents us of notation is, for each individual subject, it's clearly notational and semantically differentiated, but it seems like maybe once you try to have a kind of second order view in which it's able to make descriptive statements about like what a pitch is or what the a melody, when you can identify melody, it becomes more discursive because these identifications depend on different master notes that could be distinct for potentially many subjects. So I guess that's a long way of asking, is it possible then to read Elgin through Strawson and say that this is a system, or is it actually not? Is this fundamentally incompatible because of that privateness of the schema that Strawson?
I would say it's incompatible. I would say it's incompatible because of this privateness. Exactly. I think in the sense of Goodman and Elgin, these are public affairs. Like these are public systems that that are actually used. So I think the Strawson picture is not really a picture about a system of a representational system. It is about a categorical structure with a categorical structure of experience, which is a different affair. So, and Strawson gets out of his way to say this because at some point he's saying, what does count as an object that is to be individualized within a categorical structure? And one of the candidates of possible answers is, oh, objects are those things that we talk about, which is the quite public criteria, right, of individuation of objects. But he's not using that criteria. He's using a weaker criteria, something that you can think of as individual. So I think a system, in the sense of Goodman and Elgin, to be a system is not a private experiential affair. It's more a public means of classification of experiential contents that yield different can yield different experiences and different criteria of individuation between experience. But these criteria themselves are public, not private. So I think it's quite different because the question Strawson is asking is quite different. It's a question about the actual categorical system at place in experience itself, not the categorical system we use to change experience or to fix experience in an identity, for instance, as Goodman says, in an instrumental almost sense, right? So this is quite different, I'd say. But this is a quite good question. I think there's more to it to be explored. Thank you for that. Keep that in mind. Well, I don't think we have much time for this, but this is kind of interesting, but we'll talk about it later. So just to finish Elgin today, still, I hope we have time to finish the Strawson as well. So symbol systems are artifacts their syntactic and semantic features are not dictated by the domain, but result from decisions we make about how the domain is organized. But from this, it does not follow that we can implement anything everywhere. In system building, we never start from scratch. So one important juncture in Goodman's exploration of worldmaking, albeit proposed previously to his own coinage of the term, is the Blean-Grew paradox. Goodman asks us to imagine, besides the ordinary color predicates blue and green, two further predicates that are defined as follows. Grew, anything that is green if examined before time t, and blue after said time. Blean, anything that is blue if examined before time t, and green after said time. The point of devising such weird predicates is to challenge our current predicates as the only adequate ones. While we might think of blue and green as primitive and grew and blean as derived, the definitions given above can be reversed in order to give us green and blue out of grew and blean as primitive. So we can define green as anything that is grew if examined before time t, and blean after said time, because blean after time t is green, right? So in blue as anything that is blean if examined before time t, and grew after said time, because grew after time t is blue. So here we have two systems that impose different orders on a single realm. Which should we use? So at this point, Elgin is rehearsing the very famous blean-grew paradox that stems from Goodman's Fact, Fiction, and Forecast book. The point of this is in a sense, is what he calls the new riddle of induction. Like induction not as the inductive inference of laws from certain regularities, but induction as the criteria that we have for projecting predicates. So this is a redefinition of the riddle of induction that Goodman goes about. So the idea here is basically, as I said, to devise a different pair of predicates and to show that there is nothing to blue and green that is fundamental in an epistemological or metaphysical sense, besides their being there first, because we adopted them first. They have a history of entrenchment, okay? And of course, a common sense objection would be, yeah, but blue and green are not making reference to any time t wherein there is a modification, whereas grew and blean are. But you can define green and blue as having a reference to time t. So in the logical sense, it is unwarranted, this primitive character of blue and green. So this is Goodman's thought experiment about this. So what this yields, the conclusion that this gives us, is that entrenchment is a very important criteria, but it's not the only one. And Elgin goes on to say more about it. So she says, we cannot claim to base our current preference for green over grew on the knowledge that emeralds in the future will be green, not blue, and hence not grew, for we have no way to know this. Nor can we maintain that green is epistemically more basic or more natural than grew, for we have found no way to make sense of absolute epistemological priority. So she talks a bit more about that. So the presumption in favor of entrenched predicates in 5, the presumption in favor of entrenched predicates lasts only so long as their projection is inductively successful. Predicates whose projection leads regularly to false conclusions are unprojectable, regardless of their history. The bias in favor of entrenched categories does not preclude conceptual innovation. So there is a kind of negotiation here between conceptual innovation and the adoption of entrenched predicates, right? there is no, and this stems from the fact that there is no absolute justification for the predicates that we use. They are there and they are useful because they, in a sense, are still operative in the sense of giving, of being inductively successful in a certain sense within a certain parameter. We don't have enough reason to revise certain of the predicates that we are using. So this is the role of entrenchment. Since we don't have an absolute justification of the predicate that we are using, is just that is contingent. The predicates themselves are contingent, but they are there because they are entrenched categories. So this is the basic gist of it. And but also the fact that they are contingent paves the way to conceptual innovation. Like we can use different predicates. So this is quite important, and this is quite important for, you know, Goodman and Elgin's understanding of art or science. All of these practices yield different categorical rearrangements, in a sense. Okay, sometimes in a more dramatic way than other times, because sometimes a new predicate is not that new because the compliance class of the predicate is the same as the compliance class of a previous predicate. So the real radical reorganization comes about when you when compliance classes are different, like you are proposing a different criteria of likeness. So this is really sorting out objects into different collections, as I was saying in the beginning of the class. Let me just turn on the light. Okay, so then she talks about metaphors. In a metaphor, a familiar scheme is implicitly applied to a new realm or to its old realm in a new way. Typically, the result is a novel organization of the realm, or the metaphorical scheme classifies together objects in the realm that are not classified together by any literal scheme. And then she talks about realism. I quite like this. There's a big discussion about this as well. Like realism in depiction. Realism seems to be a matter of familiarity rather than accuracy. So this is, I don't have time to delve into this, but the idea of realism in depiction, like the difference between, I don't know, an abstract painting and a photograph for Goodman. It's not really a difference between something that naturally represents another thing and something that does not represent. It's just a difference between different routes of reference, whereas the photograph is denoting a certain object and exemplifying certain features that it has, the photograph itself has. The abstract painting is not really denoting as much as exemplifying its own properties. So if you understand these symbolizing practices in this unified framework that Goodman is proposing, the idea of realism really, in the traditional sense, doesn't make much sense because there is no virgin eye, there is no epistemological neutral ground. Like everything is constructed here and things seem natural just because we have adopted them. So, and also it places these different categories like representation within a broader framework or broader classifying framework of different relationships between marks and compliance that in a sense denaturalize representation. It's denaturalizing all the things that we take for granted in a sense. But at the same time is not debunking them. Like you're not, because of that, obliged to adopt a different conceptual framework, but you can. So it paves the way for conceptual revision without obliging one to do so. Okay.
Jean, I have a question about the metaphor. Elgin puts that the order that a metaphorical application of a scheme produces is useful, enlightening, and informative, and then it appears that it happens if and only if the affinities it highlights between the metaphorical and the literal reference of its term are interesting, important, or otherwise apt. It strikes me that these predicates, however, interesting, important, are somewhat vague. And it appears to me that this vagueness is precisely what is accounted by the concepts of forms of life. And I was wondering to what can we appeal to justify something being interesting, important, useful, informative, etc. And the choice for the term life forming in this course is actually the first time that I'm seeing it. This novelty is that it implies that there are processes that constitute these forms of life, rather than the apparent idea that forms of life can be given. But these processes, word making, life forming, they do not coincide with what you were calling upstream and downstream movements of revision. The question that I was wondering about is life forming under this perspective constituted by a process, or is the process itself that will determine and set the parameters for word making, or for what we take as interesting, informative, etc.? Is there such a priority, and if there is, at which level it occurs?
Yeah, there's a lot of different questions within the question, right? But to respond very quickly, I think the most important thing is the first one that Elgin says, like that knowledge and experience, the relationship between knowledge and experience goes both ways. So you don't really have a priority, you have a local priority. And a local priority is relative to certain local interests within a form of life. So when she says about metaphor that he's illuminating and all that, is because, within a certain set of stable parameters, there is, I don't know, the writing of literary works, and these writings produce metaphors. They use different kinds of symbolization that can be understood as metaphors, that are the transference of certain properties from one realm to another realm. And this yields a kind of rearrangement of the realm being pictured by the metaphor, in a sense, because a metaphor usually is picking out certain features of the new realm that the literal predicates are not picking. So this is the cognitive purchase of a metaphor in the Elgin and Goodmanian sense. Regarding life forming, I mean, I think of, it's not that I think of it because you just asked me, so this is out of the blue in a sense, but I could think of it as a radicalization of this two-way determination, okay? Because usually Goodman is not thinking about forms of life. He just thinks there is like this layer of habituations that make a kind of a disambiguation between the predicates that are actually being used and the conceptual apparatus, the conceptual categorical systems that are actually being used and those that are not. It paves the way for the modification. You can come up with different systems of predicates, but there are a set, let's say, a very big set of predicates that are already in use, and from the Wittgensteinian point of view, you could say that those are part of a form of life, but this is not something that Goodman is thinking about. So this is why the distinction between the upstream and the downstream makes sense, because Goodman is not really concerned about different levels of revision, only the levels that are relevant for epistemology in a sense. So usually he's cast as a thinker of aesthetics, but aesthetics is epistemology for him, which is a quite interesting for me, quite interesting position on art, because puts art into the process of knowledge. This is what I could talk about. Like out of the blue right now about what you asked, Tassi. And I want to address what Maria Korolev is saying here, like abstract paintings are thought of as semic, noise music is not differentiated, and so on. Yes, Goodman is rarely used by art critics. I agree that usually we think of abstract paintings as semic, noise music as not differentiated and all. But this is not really, I would defend Goodman on the grounds that the idea that something is asemic and not and something is not differentiated is not that informative, is it? So I am a noise musician. I'm a practitioner of noise. I'm not using Goodman necessarily to understand my noise practice, but I couldn't say that it's unrelated, because even negatively, I think Goodman's categories have helped me a lot to sort out different routes of reference. And this is the thing. Sometimes you might encounter something like the weird, notational system that is in the chapter 4 of Languages of Art, that he tries to say that all of music complies with that. I think this is obviously false, but the system still has its use. For instance, that system is perfect, for digital music, for instance. You have like a perfect compliance at place. So these are abstract schemes that can be remobilized in different contexts, in a sense. So I think it's quite important and quite interesting what he does in Languages of Art. But we should take with a grain of salt the substantive conclusions that he gives, like music is notational, literary arts are discursive, or paintings are necessarily representational because they don't have an alphabet. As I said, if you digitize a painting, and if common practice starts to understand a digitized painting as close enough to the original, you have an alphabet. This is what digitization means. So it's not a humanly detectable alphabet, but the technical apparatus guarantees the alphabet is there. So it's all strings of symbols. So,
and he's also right that paintings are symbols in themselves. Yeah. This is rarely thought of in continental philosophy and in like authors like Kazimir Malevich. He didn't think he produced a sign.
Sorry, I didn't understand the second part of what you said.
Kazimir Malevich didn't think he produced a sign. He thought of it as something metaphysical.
Oh yeah, obviously. Yeah. Actually, it's not a sign, but what is something metaphysical in painting? Maybe it's a sign of something that is absent as well. But this is we are starting to play with words here, so it's a kind of a dangerous place to be. But you mentioned Malevich, but for instance, one of the things that I find most interesting in Malevich is the fact that he painted this stuff, and he had as a paradigm, as a reference point, Russian religious icons, and icons are in a sense representational, almost stereotypically so, right, in a sense. So I was always wondering about what is the iconic nature of, for instance, suprematist painting, and is it an icon for? And I take it seriously that he's an icon in the Peircean sense, that there is a certain resemblance to something, but the resemblance is to something that is not perceivable in our immediate surroundings. So this is why he's metaphysical. So I would say that he's metaphysical because it is representation and iconic, but it's representation in this very specific sense. I wrote a piece of music on one point that is called Icon, and it was inspired by Malevich, but it was also inspired by a guy, a Russian guy, Ivan Vishnegradsky, who is a microtonal composer from the same time that Malevich, like he was part of the Russian Revolution, 1917, and then he went to Paris. I think he died like in the 70s. But he thought of a sound milieu that is a full sounding milieu. Like if you understand normal, acoustic musical practice, usually you have scales, you have, sets of discrete notes, as Goodman says. But Wittgenstein was thinking of a dance schema, a dance musical schema, wherein every interval between one note and another has an infinity of different notes. Okay, this is microtonality. But he was thinking of it like as an operational limit. Like he had this concept of pansonority. Pansonority is the summation of every sound in the absolute continuum, and obviously it is something you can't listen to. This is quite weird. There is this rational concept that is a continuum, like this. It is something that can be modeled upon the real line of numbers, something like that, because for every different point you have an infinity of points between them. But you can never have the guarantee that you are listening to the cluster of everything, because they are infinite. So you don't get to hear an infinite chord or to guarantee it. So the piece I was kind of crossing this idea of the icon in Malevich and this idea of Wittgenstein, and I did a piece that is a kind of improvisation, wherein the order is saturate a given sound space, but you will never know if the space is saturated. But you have to saturate with a certain technique, which is the emission of long sustained tones. And you have to listen to the space and see where there are gaps in the continuum, and you have to occupy that gap with a long sustaining tone. But it is obviously impossible. So of course, this is dynamizing the quest for the absolute sound continuum. And it is called icon just because I was thinking of this idea of Malevich. What is this an icon for? Like, this is an icon of a certain form of absolute that we cannot attain experientially.
It's
so
like a synonym of everything. Synonym of everything in a sort.
I'm not sure if it is everything so much as a decantation of everything, as a distillation of everything into a form, a certain form. But yeah, this is an immense talk, subject of conversation. So, and we are finishing. So let me finish the Elgin bit, and maybe we'll leave the Strawson to next week and go on from there, okay? Because we are now 7 minutes from the end of the session. So let's see. I'll finish the Elgin, at least. Where is it? Share screen. So exemplification. This is a big category in Goodman and Elgin. Some symbolized by referring to certain properties of their own. Such items are said to exemplify the properties that they both possess and refer to. So exemplification is a double operation, right? Something possess a certain property, but possessing a property is not the same as referring to that property. And you can refer to a property you don't have, like you denote the property, like the word book denotes a book without being a book or without exemplifying being a book. But you can both possess a property and refer to that property. And this is exemplification, okay? And it's exemplification in a nominalistic sense, right? Because these are particular items that both possess properties and refer to the properties they possess. It's not exemplification in the sense, in the Platonist sense, okay? So to understand our work, we need to know not just what properties it has, but which of them it exemplifies. I just picked this quote because it makes this very important difference between having a property and exemplifying a property, which has to do with a certain system that makes the routing of the thing that has the property and the relevant property it has. Okay, so symbols often exemplify metaphorically. This is another thing, and this is metaphorically exemplifying something. Expression is a special case of this. So Goodman thinks of, for instance, statements like "this music is sad" as a metaphorical exemplification. Like the music is really sad, but sad is a predicate that comes from another realm that gets applied to music, but it is real that the music is sad nevertheless. So there is metaphorical expression is metaphorical exemplification in the Goodmanian sense. Works are said to express only such properties as they metaphorically exemplify when interpreted as aesthetic symbols. So they think the symbols often exemplify metaphorically, but the expression is reserved to aesthetic symbols. We won't have the time today, but exemplification is quite interesting. Another example is like a chip. You want to put certain kind of chip in the wall of or certain kind of wallpaper in your wall, and you have like a sample of the wallpaper. You have to know what is being exemplified by the sample, because the sample has a size. So if you go to someone and says, yeah, make me a wallpaper like this, maybe the person will give you like a thing of the same size. This is a categorical mistake, because what is being exemplified by the sample is not its size, but the pattern that is inscribed upon it. So I want a wallpaper with this pattern. So this is why, possessing a property is different. Of course, anything has an indeterminate amount of properties, different properties, and they exemplify only certain properties within certain contexts. So exemplification is quite interesting. So, and then there's multiplicity. The difficulty is this: the standards of rightness we take our systems to be subject to, and the goals we want them to realize, may be jointly unsatisfiable. Like you can satisfy a certain objective with a certain system, but for other objective, that system is completely inaccurate or even wrong. So pluralism results. A number of independently acceptable systems can be constructed, none of which has a claim to epistemological primacy. So this is the overarching statement of Goodman's philosophy in a certain sense. I think this is the end of the Elgin bit. Yeah, and then we'll go to Strawson. Unfortunately, I don't think we won't have the time today for the Strawson. I'll try to yeah, we are still discussing the black square in the chat. We won't have the time to go into the Strawson today. Okay. But okay, in these final moments, if you have any further questions about the session, I'll be happy to answer and wrap it up for today then.
I have a question. Sorry if it's stupid question, because I've been getting like a lot of cut audio on my Zoom. I don't know if it's the internet, so sometimes.
Let me ask: is everybody like that, or everybody's listening to me? Okay?
No, it's just me. I'm getting in other seminars as well.
This is worrying. Oh, this is worrying. Okay, go on.
Yeah, no, I think it's just me. I already asked in Daniel's seminar. But anyway, I was just wondering, like, if you could clarify the relation, like how it maps onto, I mean, the passage between knowledge and experience that you're associating with Goodman, and the problem of life forming and world making, in the sense that does life forming correspond somehow to experience, and world making to knowledge, or do they both fall into one side? And then, like, in that context, I'm still trying to start to understand whether life forming is something that's like internal or immanent to the representations or to the models or to the construction that you're making, or if it's something that falls more to the side of like the mystical in the Wittgensteinian sense, or to like something that's not in the construction as such, but which you can remanage while you're wielding your world constructions. Like, how does that relate?
Okay, no, I don't think world making is like knowledge, and life forming is like experience, because I'm thinking that world making jointly changes knowledge and experience, because, as I said, the knowledge you have is something that constrains the experience you can have. And the experience you had sometimes force you to revise the knowledge that you have. So, of course, this kind of muddy the waters in a sense, because then there's the issue of the limits of this. And this has been asked, like, I don't know, I think it was Cassio, somebody asked a question about boundaries here between sensible contents and conceptual apparatus, in a sense. And I think this can be tackled throughout the course. This is quite a difficult question. But the point is that world making deals jointly with both these things, like the experience one has and the knowledge one has of these experience that is constraining and determining the experiences themselves. And life forming, for me, the question of differentiating this from either forms of life, but life forming in my sense, it's not just a modification of an experience, it's a modification of habitual behaviors. And in that sense, it's a modification that entails also the material constraints of a certain form of life. It doesn't have, I'm not assimilating experience, the materiality to experience. Okay, this is I think a commitment I must make explicit, not assimilating these things. I know Deleuzians usually think of experience as also including all the material realm, all of that. I'm not thinking like that. I'm thinking that there is something that is constraining experience that is not experience itself as well. And there is something that is knowledge of this experience that is not itself an experience. It is an experience of knowledge, but not experience as such. Okay, and life forming, of course, forms of life, they are detectable through the conceptual unfoldings they are responsible for and responsible to. But at the same time, these conceptual unfoldings, they have material results. So this is like a very important consequence that I think we will have to deal with it in its proper time. But this goes to show that forms of life, of course, forms of life are not really experienced, are they? Like, the experiences we have are in a form of life, but we don't have the experience of the form of life itself unless we take a step back and have a synoptic view of our conceptual / emotional experiential unfoldings within the form of life, right? So you have kind of something akin to an epistemological break there in order to think of forms of life as subjectable to intervening intervening attitude, in the sense that I would like to generalize within this course. Of course, this is a speculative hypothesis. I might be completely wrong about all these things. But yeah, I'll get to the Davidson next time. Can I, please remember that I want to comment upon this Davidson business there. Okay, but because we are out of please Alex, because we are out of time today. So yeah, I don't think this is a complete answer, but I think it's a start of the beginning of an answer right there. Not sure. So I think that would be all. Kelly, I think we will have to do that business with the email and see who wants to make presentation.
I'll send it out later tonight, and if people can get back to me by early this week, that'll be great.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you all.
Thanks.
Please email me any questions and we can continue this discussion. Yes. I'll make the Google Classroom and we'll include everybody here. And so you have the PowerPoint presentations, and I think I might include some other secondary texts. There is the basic readings, but there will be maybe some more secondary text. There is one very important text I might ask, like a basic reading for the final session, which is Paul Livingstone's Politics of Logic.
Actually, the Google Classroom already exists.
Yeah, but I'm saying this because
to add.
Sorry. I'm saying this because last time I gave a class, the Google Classroom was there, but people weren't really added to it. So you have to see,
right.
Yeah,
okay,
see what I mean. So I have to add everybody that's in the class to the Google Classroom. So we really have to have the list of every panelist. So to have to put them in the Google Classroom. So we can have this ongoing conversation about the course. So thank you all. See ya.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.